atomic gigantification was a sweeping Japan nation when along came a dude with an ultra attitude, a Kamen Rider who's the greatest kicker of Japan. And of all, man, life's too short now, baby, to not talk big now, baby.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Kaiju Conversation. I'm your host, Elijah, and joining me, as always, my lovely co-host and editor.
Hello, I am Rex.
And we are back at it again for the second episode of 2024, and we are beginning the hype train. I guess the Stray Monsters kind of started it.
Yeah, that was kind of our intent with it.
With the hype train for the upcoming release of Legendary Pictures and Warner Brothers' Godzilla Kong, The New Empire, Do America at Waffle House.
I don't eat waffles, so, you know.
Do you eat pancakes?
No.
Because waffles are just muscular pancakes.
Well, I drink neither. Wait.
You drink neither? Well, I would hope you're not drinking the batter exclusively, because that could get you like salmonella or something crazy. Are you sure you're not drinking something, or are you under the influence?
Hey, no, that was last night, okay?
Well, I guess that transitions into my question.
Incredible transition, I must say.
How have you been?
My stupidity knows no ends.
Well, how have you been? Explain to me what has happened in the last 24 hours, and just in general, because you've been too cool to talk to me.
Sorry, man. But, you know, I am just the coolest person on the planet, so, you know, everyone else just keeps trying to steal my time away. But in seriousness, the last 24 hours have been pretty fun. I had a pretty fun day yesterday clubbing from about was at the clubs from 8 p.m. till about 3 a.m. So pretty long night, pretty tiring, but it was a lot of fun. I go fairly crazy, a little, you know. So that's been fun, you know. At 2 a.m. last night, I saw some people get married in one of the clubs. So good on them. And yeah, that's been interesting. Goes in some strange directions some days, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Nice. And have you watched any Tokusatsu lately?
I've been keeping myself catched up with Garo Hagane o Tsugumono, the latest series. And that's been pretty good so far. Outside of that, since last time, I rewatched Tetsuo the Iron Man with a friend of mine.
Nice.
Seen it before.
Nice. I love that.
And I also rewatched a little movie called Godzilla -1.
Nice. So how many times have you seen it?
9 times.
9? Okay. Mm-hmm. You gotta see it one more time.
How?
Is it out of theaters officially?
Yeah.
Dang. Well, it's all right.
It almost feels sad that it's gone now. I kind of liked having it being around so I could just go whenever I felt like it.
It's the end of an era.
From what I hear, you have seen -1 a couple more times recently, so why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I did get to see Godzilla -1 minus color.
Congratulations, it got released in your country.
It did. Do you care to hear the spoilers of what's changed?
Isn't it literally just they changed the Toho logo? They've got the Japanese text, and there was one other thing I think was changed. Outside of the fact it's in black and white.
So at the beginning you have the color logo, right? And then it cuts to the 1950s logo. So you do have that little thing. That's really cool. An interesting thing that this confirmed was there's two versions of the film. There's the international version, which has English title cards for all the time jumps and locations, and the English title Godzilla -1 written out.
I don't think anyone should be surprised by this.
Well, that was a question that I had. I wasn't sure what the answer was, so I was kind of happy to get an answer. So the black and white version minus color, they didn't have time to make a international cut of that. So
Right.
you got to see the original Japanese title, location, and time cards for Tokyo, Odo Island, the Ogasawara, off the shore of Ogasawara. So that was really cool. The English dialogue spoken in the black and white segment in the middle of the film, that's black and white in the actual colored version, there's Japanese subtitles. So that's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was...
And then you have the Godzilla -1.0 logo at the very end, which I love that. I love that logo. I love the way that that's written. That's my preferred way to write the title. So that's really cool. And then they added a In Loving Memory in English credit at the end for Shuji Abe, the producer, the guy who worked
I didn't know about that.
Yep, they added that. He was the guy that founded Robot Communications that gave Takashi Yamazaki a job, and of course was one of the producers on Godzilla -1, his final film before he passed away. So he got a credit. The In Loving Memory is in English, and then the Shuji Abe part is in kanji, and then it says 1949 to 2023. Outside of that, everything else is the same. The black and white does look really good. They added some film grain. Of course, they adjusted the mats and they changed the CGI and all that. It's a very thorough black and white version. If you were to take any of the drama scenes, I believe, and put them somewhere out of context and ask what year the film was made, I think people would say the 50s or 60s or 40s. It's that good. The Godzilla black and white, like the CGI Godzilla, is not the best. I mean, it looks good. It doesn't work, in my opinion.
I mean, yeah, a CG Godzilla in black and white, it's not going to be quite the same as guy in suit black and white.
Yeah. So I will say there's one scene in particular. It's in the Ginza sequence where Godzilla charges up his beam and blasts the Diet building. And then the shot of him in black and white looking up at the mushroom cloud is really, really, really good.
That's just the best scene of the movie.
It is. But no, it's a very good decolorized version of the film. I picked up on all the differences and I ended up watching it a total of 9 times. When we last stopped the count, it was at 21 times I had seen Godzilla -1. I was going to see it on Friday, the day it came out, but I was sick, which I'll explain here in a second when I tell you what I've been doing since our last recording. But I was sick, so I had to cancel my ticket, and I ended up having to wait 2 days to see it on Sunday. And then on Sunday, I ended up watching it 3 times. And then Monday, I watched it. Sunday, I watched it twice. Monday, I saw it 3 times. So that went from 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. On Wednesday, I watched it 3 more times, which was 27, 28, 29. And then I just, before Wednesday, I made it the goal to see it 30 times. I wanted to see it 30 times so that I would be able to say that I saw the film 30 times, which is the same amount of live-action Japanese-produced Godzilla movies in 70 years. So I was hoping to make it on Thursday, which was the last day, February 1st. Um, I don't know if I should say this, because I don't know if anybody listens to the show that I work with. I'm thinking not, so I'm gonna say this. I had a family member call me while I was at work. I had to work that day, and there was one showing of the film. It was at 7:30, and it was 30 minutes away. And I closed, so I couldn't go see it. I had a family member call me and tell me that there was a family emergency. Now, I've had some recent family emergencies, so I was like, oh no, like what's going on with it? And it was actually, they just wanted to take me to go see Godzilla -1 minus color.
Nah, that's a real moment of them. I respect that.
And so we drove the 30 minutes. We got to the theater on time. We got in. We watched the movie. I was going to go back to work. So I left at 6:50 and I got back at 10:20. So I had 40 minutes left of my shift. There wasn't a lot left, but I was willing to come back and stay and close, but my boss said no. So I ended up getting out of work early. So now that's on record. If anybody I work with somehow listens to this, I'm off the clock, and I plead the Fifth Amendment right.
No. If anyone from Elijah's work listening to this, it's just a joke. He's just kidding.
I'm just kidding, but I definitely hit 30 times seeing Godzilla -1.
Yeah. But like the skipping work bit and all that, that's a joke.
It's a joke. It doesn't exist. It can't hurt you.
There was a real family emergency.
I mean, it very well could have been.
Exactly, because it was.
Yeah. Now, so part of it too was I wanted to see the film on the last day because I got to see it on the first day it showed in the US. I wanted to see it on the last day, and I tried.
Oh yes, yeah, same for me. I saw it the first possible day I could see it. I saw it the first day it came out. I fit properly, and then I saw it on the last day.
It felt right. And for this film, like it's something like I even tried to like work it out so that I didn't have that problem. But it didn't work out that way. So I had to, make it work. So in a way it was very fitting. I hit 30 Godzilla movies produced in Japan, 70 years, 70th anniversary film. On the last day that you could possibly see it in the States. It just felt right. And I got to see it in the theater that I saw it for the first time in. So it went full circle. It felt like the proper way to end the -1 story. I probably will never see another film in theaters that many times.
Oh, same. I don't think there's any other movie where I could do that for.
Between you and I now,
unless it was like Final Wars, if they just showed that in cinemas
for 3 months,
yeah, I would see it maybe 200 times. Not gonna lie,
but no. So between you and I, we've seen it 39 times. One of my not a mutual, but a friend of my friend at Kaiju United, Jacob. His name's Nick. Saw it 32 times. So between us two, we saw it 62 times. And I know there's somebody out there that saw it like 37 times. So if that's how many times you saw it and you stopped at that, that means that between us three, the film was viewed over 100 times. So I'm not the one who has seen it the most, but I'm definitely top 5. I watched it as much as I could. I probably could have seen it like one more time than I actually did. But when you've been at the theater from like noon until 10 p.m., you kind of get tired and you're hungry and you want to go home because you drove to another state just to watch it in a premiere format. And it was a whole thing. But yeah, so I saw it 30 times. I saw it in, I think, 8 different theaters, 8 different formats in 3 states. So my -1 story, I think, is about over. I got to talk about it on the Monster Island Film Vault podcast as a bonus thing they were doing right after I got out of my first viewing. So I got to talk about -1 more, and here we are talking about it again. I think if you were to take all of my -1 talk, you could probably formulate about 24 hours worth of content. Speaking of stuff that of content I've done and whatnot, I have been a very busy individual. I've published 2 articles on Kaiju United. Both were republishing issues from Kaiju Ramen, which is officially now dead. The first one, Kong, King of Exploitation, a overview of all of the Kong knockoffs that are not officially licensed King Kong films. That was originally published in Kaiju Ramen issue 9. And then issue 10, which is not out yet, I got to interview Donnie Winter, and so I decided to publish that. So that just recently came out on Kaiju United. And for that, there was an attached video, so I had to go and I had to edit the video more than I already did, and I published that to my YouTube channel, ET13 Productions. So I published a new video, and I got another article out, so I have 2 articles with more to come. So I did that. Of course, we put out episode 85 for Destroy All Monsters. And I've been working on a project that's official kaiju stuff. I've got some stuff that's already confirmed for the project that's set in stone. It's sent out. It's ready. It's going to be included. And there's a project that I'm working on that I can't talk about. That you, Rex, you are one of 2 people that know the most about it and have actually heard some of what it is. Mm-hmm. And you know, like I've put in a lot of effort on that. So that's a project I'm working on that hopefully by next podcast recording I can say is 100% done and sent off, and it's ready to be announced. So I've got that in the works. However, during all of this, before the -1 stuff, after the Destroy All Monsters episode, and the Kong King of Exploitation, I got really, really sick. Mm-hmm. I missed 3 days of work. I was sick for 5 days. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't look at my TV, my phone, or my laptop screen. I couldn't play audio from my laptop, my phone, my Bluetooth speaker, or my TV at loud volume because it hurt my head. I had this horrible cough that led to a terrible migraine. I had a congestion. I had insomnia. I went 5 days without sleeping for longer than 2 hours at a time.
Jesus.
I couldn't eat because everything I ate went through me very quickly and was out. So I wasn't eating. I drank a ton of water. I drank 4 gallons of water in 4 days.
I don't know how much a gallon is.
A lot. And outside of that, I had a fever. The highest my fever got up to was 103.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So Rex, for you, that's in Celsius.
Oh my God! 1 US gallon is equivalent to 3.78. What the fuck? Jesus Christ!
It's a lot of water.
Times.
And for
Jesus Christ, you had like 15 liters of water. What the fuck?
I was drinking a lot of water in my
Oh, well, I guess
fever.
It was the only thing you consumed, actually.
It was like that, and like a cup of orange juice a day. That was all I had. That's all I drank. My fever got up to 39.7 degrees Celsius. It was awful, and I couldn't sweat. And the only time I could sweat was when I was cold. So I had cold sweats. I couldn't sleep. I had a fever. I had headaches. I was congested. I had an awful, awful cough. I couldn't eat. It was a whole thing. And it took me 5 days. And I had to cancel -1 tickets. I had to call into work. I had to leave work early because of how awful I was feeling. I couldn't really watch anything. I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't listen to anything. So it was like just sitting there in silence and in pain. I was able to watch a little bit of Alf, season 1. Just that's my comfort show. And then I watched the most recent season of Futurama. Of course, I couldn't sit through all of it at once, and I had to have my brightness really down and the volume down. But I did sit through them. I did watch them. But none of that's tokusatsu. If we're talking about tokusatsu, outside of Minus Color, I did watch one tokusatsu movie, and that is Psycho Shark, also known as Jaws in Japan, which is a steaming pile of dog doo-doo that is awful in every regard.
Sounds like we should cover that.
One day we will. One day.
We should cover that today, maybe, you know?
No.
Let's put it on.
No.
And even better, how about you, lead it? I'll just sit back and be like, yeah, right. And not even watch it, you know?
Now that you mention that, I kind of forgot what are we covering today?
Well, in anticipation for Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, I figured, since we did Destroy All Monsters, a Godzilla movie last time, I think it would be fitting to do a King Kong movie.
Okay. So, what was the last King Kong movie we covered?
Well, we've covered the original Son of Kong and 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, so I figure the next step would be 1967's King Kong Escapes, naturally.
Oh, King Kong no Gyakushu.
Gyakushu, yeah.
Also known as King Kong's Counterattack.
Yes.
I love those titles, by the way. This is a side tangent, but you have Gojira no Gyakushu, also known as Godzilla Raids Again, Godzilla's Counterattack. And then you have Mechagodzilla no Gyakushu, which is Mechagodzilla's Counterattack, known as Godzilla versus, or not Godzilla versus, Terror of Mechagodzilla. But yeah, so we are covering the 1967 film King Kong Escapes. Mm-hmm. Funny enough, we've covered Son of Godzilla. We've covered The X from Outer Space. We've covered Gappa. This is the last 1967 major kaiju film that we haven't covered. If you want to be technical, there is Yongori Monster from the Deep that Toei co-produced, but that never saw a theatrical release in Japan. It got canceled. So technically that doesn't count.
I mean, if you want to be technical, you'd also count things like that Ultraman compilation movie.
And we haven't talked any TV yet, so we can't talk about Ultraman or Ultra 7 or I want to say there's one other title from 1967. I have a list of all the 1960s. Kaiju Buska.
Oh.
And Red Shadow, also known as Kamen no Akage. It's Kamen no Ninja Akage, which is masked ninja red shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is Monster Prince and then Giant Robo.
Mm-hmm. Giant Robo. How could I forget about that?
But all of those are TV, and we haven't covered a TV show on here. So yes, this is our final major kaiju film from 1967 that we haven't talked about. So with this ends the kaiju boom year. So maybe at the end of this we should also do a ranking of the 1967 kaiju films.
I guess we'll see. Yeah, so as we mentioned on those various 67 films, this was kind of during this was kind of the last this was the peak year for the monster boom of the 60s, essentially, with all these movies and TV shows that we've now mentioned.
Right. And a lot of that just has to do, honestly, most of it has to do with timing, because Nikkatsu and Shochiku just so happened to time it perfectly with Toho.
Right.
To put out films. But more so than that, Toho had the rights to King Kong until 1968, and they had been trying to get a King Kong film off the ground for a while now.
Right.
There was King Kong versus Godzilla, or continuation King Kong versus Godzilla, which would have been a sequel to King Kong versus Godzilla. I believe that was scheduled to come out in 1963.
Yeah, from what I recall, yeah.
But that fell through. And then there were, I want to say after that, Toho was then put King Kong on ice while they were doing Godzilla, which makes sense because there's 2 Godzilla films in 65 and then 64. And then 65 saw Astro Monster and Frankenstein versus Baragon. And they were busy with that United Pictures of America contract that ended in 67 with the War of the Gargantuas. But in 1966, they did propose the idea of a King Kong film, Operation Robinson Crusoe, King Kong versus Ebirah.
Yeah.
Which I don't remember. Did we talk about that during the Ebirah episode?
Yeah.
Did we?
Yeah. Yeah, we did.
I couldn't remember. Do we want to kind of cover the basis of that again?
Yeah, we could give like a sort of just like an overview of it again. Yeah, essentially there's sort of like 2 versions of the story for that. One that involves Operation Crusoe, being a script, the script for it being entirely Toho made, and one with it being originally an American script that Shinichi Sekizawa sort of took and worked with.
Yeah. From what I did, I went and I bought some new books, and I did some research on to see if there was anything else really new about that. From what I found in that, the draft was finalized, or was dated for July 13th of 1966.
Yeah.
So the film, it's the story of Ibra Horror of the Deep, or Godzilla versus the Sea Monster, or Godzilla, Ebirah, Mothra, Big Duel in the South Seas, whatever title you want to go by. It's essentially the same script, except one had Godzilla, one had Kong. The inclusion of Mothra was because of a recent poll found that Mothra was one of the more popular kaiju, so they wanted to put Mothra in there just as a Toho. Yeah. So from what I could find, the film was written by Sekizawa. Jun Fukuda was the proposed director, and Sademasa Arikawa was the proposed effects director. They would all end up working on the final film with the Godzilla story instead.
Yeah.
When they proposed it to Rankin Bass, because Rankin Bass was the ones wanting to produce a film, apparently RKO's the one that told Toho to talk with Rankin Bass. Mm-hmm. And when they gave the proposal, it took some subtle influences from the King Kong show that was airing on television at the time, with animation done by Toei Animation, the King Kong show. Apparently, they took some subtle influences for like the giant condor from like episode 4 of the show, where a giant bird comes in. But Ebirah and Mothra were completely original. The idea of a terrorist organization taking control of Mondo Island and using it for nuclear testing was in an episode as well. But that was about the extent of the influence of the King Kong show.
Mm-hmm.
Rankin Bass took a look at this. They didn't like the idea of the Arakawa-Fukuda duo working on it. They threw that out. They didn't like it not being clearly adapted from the show, so they told Tanaka no. Tanaka then approached. So even before that, Tanaka apparently, now there's some conflicting reports on this. Tanaka apparently proposed an idea for a live-action television series produced by Toho about King Kong, and RKO's the one that said no to that. But also apparently Rankin Bass wanted to do a live-action adaptation of the King Kong show, and so that's where the idea of the film really started moving. But it's conflicting on that because RKO technically couldn't tell Toho no to anything they were producing, so that story doesn't really line up. And from what I hear, the idea of a live-action version was a story from Arthur Rankin, who might have just simply been misremembering what was going on. But nonetheless, the film did eventually get made. Rankin Bass specifically requested the Honda Tsuburaya duo to work on the film, which is why you had Fukuda and Arikawa doing Son of Godzilla that year, and Honda and Tsuburaya doing King Kong Escapes. King Kong Escapes was hailed as Toho's 35th anniversary film. It was on the list of those celebratory films, much like how King Kong vs. Godzilla was the 30th anniversary film paired up with Yojimbo from Akira Kurosawa that year.
Yeah, I tried actually looking into some of the King Kong show, see how much was out there, and I didn't actually realize until recently that a good chunk of the show was kind of lost media.
Yeah, the first 8 episodes were released by Classic Media, which I own those. And then only a handful of them after that are available, and most of them I believe are in black and white.
Damn.
So yeah, a portion of the show's lost, and so there's also an image out there of a volume 3 that Classic Media was going to do of the King Kong show, but that never got released. Now, whether or not that was because a lack of content to be shown or a lack of volume 1 and 2 doing well, or just something happened and it fell through, we don't know. But it could have been Godzilla, the animated series, volume 3 also was very hard to come by. I know hunting that down for me was a hassle because it was hard to find a copy less than $150 back in the day.
Yeah.
But no, this, and I remember King Kong Escapes growing up. That film, it never saw a Laserdisc, Betamax, VHS, or Super 8 release. It was released in Japan. It was released July 22nd, 1967, double featured with the Ultraman compilation film that included footage from episode 1, 8, 26, and 27. And then in America, it was released June 19th of 1968 by Universal. And then Honda would later re-edit the film and re-release it in 1973, a part of the Toho Champion Matsuri Festival. But the film never saw a release. It wouldn't be until 2005 when the DVD would be released to coincide with the release of King Kong vs. Godzilla on DVD. And that was a really hard DVD to find for me when I was becoming a Godzilla fan.
I imagine that also be released in 2005 to coincide with the remake that came out.
Yes, it was. You're correct. So for me, a lot of the my introduction to King Kong Escapes was through the documentary Godzilla and Other Movie Monsters, where they showed some footage of Mechani-Kong, King Kong, and Gorosaurus, and they briefly talked about it. So for me, that was one of those films like Atragon that was whoa, there's another Japanese monster or men in suit monster movie out there that I've never seen. I've seen this footage and it looks really cool. Where is it?
Right.
And then years later in 2014, to coincide with the release of Godzilla 2014, Universal put out Blu-rays for King Kong Escapes and King Kong vs. Godzilla, along with a triple pack with those two films paired with Universal's other King Kong movie, King Kong 2005.
Yeah.
But the Japanese
releases of the Japanese cut, though.
Yeah, no, the Japanese version is completely omitted, just like King Kong vs. Godzilla, except that, thankfully, that film did get its Japanese version released on Blu-ray through the Criterion Collection in 2019. But King Kong Escapes has not had that luxury. I would like to think that if Criterion does like a Ishirō Honda box set, because they have the rights to all of his kaiju films outside of Gorath and King Kong Escapes, I would like to think that that is very possible because, I mean, they already sub-licensed King Kong versus Godzilla. Surely King Kong Escapes could be the same process.
Yeah.
But
I'd imagine so.
King Kong Escapes was one of the last, I mean, it was probably the last King Kong film I saw. And then it was one of the later Toho Kaiju films for me. So for me, it was always kind of that like legendary-esque film that I never could see, much like Destroy All Monsters was for a long time.
See, I don't have quite the history with that because it's kind of just like, I want to say this is one of the earlier Toho non-Godzilla films that I saw, alongside like Mothra and Rodan, I think.
Gotcha.
Bear in mind, I've only seen like all those films once. I'm well overdue for a rewatch of Mothra and Rodan. Well overdue.
See, we haven't covered a lot of the Toho Kaiju films on the show, and those definitely should be some of the films we eventually do cover.
I'd imagine so.
Yeah. Now, before we dive into the actual film, did you have... I've got a few other pre-production pieces of information. Did you have anything else?
Not on pre-production, no.
I have one more, and that's simply the fact that the sea serpent, which is a surprise fourth monster in the film, wasn't in the first draft of the script. That was a later addition to the film.
Right. I mean, the thing is with the sea serpent and also Gorosaurus is that I don't think what they actually were, like a dinosaur and a sea serpent, I don't think that was actually... I don't have confirmation for this, but from what I was reading, at least in Gorosaurus' case, it sounds like they just had Kong fights a monster, but they didn't really know what it was going to be.
Yeah.
Because in Gorosaurus' case, the monster they were originally going to have Kong fight was being designed by the main suit designer for Return of Ultraman. But like when Yasuyuki Inoue, who's like the art director on a lot of Toho films, and Nobuyuki Yasumaru kind of checked up on him, not only was he like super busy and all that, they also just weren't impressed with the creature that he designed. They're like, what is this? Like this movie, this is a King Kong movie. We need to be on our A game here. So yeah, they took it into their own hands, and Yasumaru, Gorosaurus was the first like main kaiju suit he really built, and he did it with some new techniques that hadn't really been used for any of the other Toho kaiju at the time, which allowed he had like a specific method with urethane and building a styrofoam body with like a urethane frame in it, that the way he built it would allow for more movement for the actors compared to what Toho was doing previously with their suits.
Gotcha. And I know, at least in Gorosaurus's case, like the name of the monster wasn't decided until a year later when he appeared in Destroy All Monsters. And the only reason he appeared in Destroy All Monsters was simply because they still had the suit.
Yeah. And it was in pretty good condition.
Right. And for his appearance in All Monsters Attack, they just reused stock footage from
and then in Go Godman, his suit was just not in the best condition.
Right, but that was an official appearance by Gorosaurus. He was named as Gorosaurus in that.
Whereas Kong appears in that and is just some random ape.
Yeah. And for Gorosaurus's part, that was his last, and that still is his last official appearance. He was in a draft of Final Wars, but later was replaced by Zilla.
Poor boy. My poor boy.
Outside of that, though, he hasn't really shown up outside of comic books.
I mean, Singular
and,
Point,
Godzilla Island.
Singular Point terrestrial design takes a bit of influence from him, as do the other early forms for Godzilla in that show with Varan and Titanosaurus. But
Gorosaurus is an interesting character. I've always been curious because, like, Mechanicon was supposed to show up again, but due to copyright, they couldn't have him appear. I'm kind of surprised Gorosaurus doesn't fall into that same situation.
I guess maybe it's just because Gorosaurus is a Toho creation, not specifically derived from King Kong, since, Gorosaurus is a dinosaur.
Right.
And
the name wasn't decided until another film.
Yeah.
But then you also, like, Mechanicon was derived from the King Kong show, but so was Giant Condor. But they don't credit that, but also they don't really ever use Giant Condor for specific reasons of, like, you can't really copyright that. There's a whole thing with it.
I don't know if Toho cares enough to bring back the Giant Condor, I'm going to be honest.
Well, he did make a brief appearance, I think,
outside
in
of
Godzilla.
All Monsters Attack, yeah.
I think he did make an appearance in Godzilla Here Be Dragons. Here There Be Dragons. I think he did make a brief, like...
I mean, doesn't Mechanicon get, like, a reference in one of the Godzilla Rivals comics? Because there's, like, a character in that comic that is very much like a reference to Doctor Who from this movie.
I think so, but also Mechanicon appears in Godzillaland.
Huh.
So Mechanicon has appeared in official work since then. But I think it's just that. I think he appeared in Godzillaland in, like, one scene. And then he just hasn't.
Oh, Godzilla. Oh, that's probably like is it like Adventure Godzillaland?
I think so.
Oh, yeah. I mean, King Kong appears in that as well.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Appearance. Yeah, he makes a couple unlicensed appearances. It's literally just like a still image of, like, a cartoon King Kong design.
Well, but then you also have the technicality of, and this is how, like, the Monsterverse does it, where Toho technically could do a Kong movie. As long as it's not derived from the original 33 film, its sequel, or the 2005 film, technically speaking, they could do whatever. And they could do a Mechanicon. Technically, they could do that. Godzilla, the series, referenced Mechanicon with the robot Yeti.
Oh, yeah, there is an episode about that. That's right.
Mm-hmm. So, like, the film definitely has its legacy and has definitely been referenced. And I'm going to talk about it as we get into the plot here. But Godzilla vs. Kong basically rips off the plot of this movie to a T. So, and I guess technically it would have ripped it off more if the whole, like, Mega Godzilla thing actually was in the film. To an extent. But that's for a different discussion. If you're ready, Rex, I'm ready to dive into this.
I think it's about time we begin, brother.
So the film starts off with some undersea footage of a submarine, which very much reminds me of like Terror of Mechagodzilla or even like Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And we get our opening title credits and some music. And for some reason, they include Kong's roar sporadically through the opening credits.
Yeah.
Which I don't... I think it's a little jarring.
Weird contrast. Yeah. No, I agree.
I do wonder if it's that way in the Japanese version, or if that's something where like where Universal and Rankin Bass were like, let's throw this in here because we want people to think that
it is in the Japanese version. From what I recall reading and hearing, it was in the Japanese version. But for something that isn't in the Japanese version, actually, is our first scene following this, where we're introduced to one of our lead characters, Susan, played by Linda Miller, on the submarine, just responding to some of the sailors' questionable comments on her.
Right. Now, it's also important to note that Linda Miller was a model in Japan at the time.
Yes.
And she was actually the first person to be cast in the film. Rankin Bass saw her in like a magazine, or Arthur Rankin, sorry. Arthur Rankin saw her in a magazine and was like, she's going to be in the movie. And they like tracked her down and hired her on the spot. Her mother helped like make sure she got enough money for it. But she was 18 at the time, and she was excited to be in a movie, and she was the first person in the film to be cast, which filming started in spring of 1967, by the way. So this is probably March of 67. So it probably filmed from March till April or May, and then
I read that
June.
Filming was about 4 months. I remember Rhodes Reason, the main actor, mentioning about 4 months, I think.
So it probably started in March and went through March, April, May, and into June, and then ended, and then they probably edited it after that. Which is a surprising quick turnaround. Granted, in Japan, like Godzilla vs. Megalon was shot in 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And edited within a month, and they put it out. So
yeah,
it's not the craziest turnaround.
The Ibra episode, that was turned around fairly quickly as well.
Right. But following the introduction to Linda Miller's character, we do get our introduction to Commander Carl Nelson and Lieutenant Commander Jiro Nomura, played by Kira Takarada.
The absolute legend.
And in here, we do get a bit of exposition with Carl Nelson explaining he had been on some journeys to this area, and he was interested in the legend of Kong, a giant gorilla that lived on an island.
In this movie, he lives on Mondo Island.
Right, and he's 60 feet tall, which is smaller than his appearance in King Kong vs. Godzilla. To my understanding, the way that it was never intended to be a sequel to that. It was never even intended to be connected to the Godzilla films, but has, retroactively been connected to
thanks to Gorosaurus.
Thanks to Gorosaurus to the films. But there is I think John LeMay pointed this out. In King Kong vs. Godzilla, they do allude to the idea of Kong is bigger because he eats the berries on Faroe Island. And in Toho reading material, they credit this as Kong's second generation.
Yeah.
So there's a point to be argued here, but they also act like Kong is the largest and only monster on the planet. So,
yeah,
it's Showa era
for you.
Yeah.
it's loose at best. But yeah, in spite of the King Kong discussions, we find out that Nelson and co aren't really. Their mission has nothing to do really with King Kong or Mondo Island. They're just on some sort of mission for the UN, and King Kong is just kind of like a side bit of research that Nelson's interested in.
And this is where we cut to some more establishing, some more exposition in the Arctic, where we have our villain of the story, Doctor Who, HUU, in the Japanese. In English, it's been translated to Dr. WHO, like the British television show character.
In the Japanese dub, it's spelled Fu, which is...
There's like 3 different ways it's been he's been named.
I mean, the katakana used for his name is a sound closer to F. So, you know.
So, you know, it's a little, you know, conflicting on how you pronounce his name or say his name or write his name.
I'm just calling him Doctor Who, like the TV show.
Yeah, it's Doctor Who. Who shows off his most recent invention to Madame X, Madame Piranha. Neither name's said in either of the versions of the film, but it's still her name.
They just call her Madam in the film.
And this is where we get the reveal of Mechani-Kong, the first robot doppelganger, predating Mechagodzilla by about 8 years, or 7 years. We find out that this is based off of some schematics that Carl Nelson made, that he stole from him and retrofitted into a robot Kong. And then this is where we're introduced to Element X, which is probably it's some sort of radioactive material. We don't know what exactly, but it's established that it's a very powerful element that could make Madame X's country very, very powerful. And this is where I need to start talking about some of the interesting things. So first, I want to say the Arctic set's really good. It's easily my favorite set in the film. It's beautiful.
The miniature, some of them, like the shot when Mechani-Kong is first like released into the Arctic, and you really like see the miniature set around him, like the miniature base. Beautiful. Reminds me of, not as detailed, but it reminds me of the set from some of the sets from Gorath. And Gorath is some of Tsuburaya's best work, I'd say.
Gotcha. See, I love the set. I think it looks great.
It's almost a shame they don't show off that set more, honestly, in the film.
Right, I agree. Because it's really good.
It's the best set in the movie, I think.
I would agree with that. Wholeheartedly. Another interesting thing is this is where we really start to see the connections to Godzilla versus Kong and King Kong Escapes. You have a evil doctor that wears like this coat that it's like just sitting on the outer, like on his shoulders, and he doesn't have his arms through them. Like what's his name?
Damien Biche's Walter Simmons.
Walter Simmons. There we go. They both have that same style. Both have a mechanical doppelganger of one of the main monsters, and they're needing a element or a power source from inside the Earth to power things, both of radioactive nature, both with the blue light aura to them. And both need to go in to get this through the Arctic, inside of the Earth. So that's the first establishing.
And they use King Kong to reach it.
They use King Kong to reach it. They take him there by flying him. They lift him. They find a way to communicate and control him. GVK uses a little girl. King Kong Escapes uses an actual mind control mechanism. The film ends, or the film ends with the doppelgangers fighting. Is there any other connections or any other? There's a serpent-esque creature that like tries to choke Kong. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. They drug
if you
Kong?
want to stretch it, the way Mechanicong's defeated is human interference, similar to Mechagodzilla's defeat. If you want to stretch it,
That's true. I think that's technically all of the.
It's about all I can recall from what I remember of GVK.
So like it's not the entire film, but there is a lot of similarities, and this is where they kind of start. And then there's other things you could probably pull influences from for GVK and whatnot, but King Kong Escapes definitely had some sort of impact on the film, I would imagine.
There are quite a few similarities.
There are just based off of what we've talked about. I think those are some pretty decent similarities. I feel like the sea serpent connection to the war bat's a little bit of a stretch.
That's a stretch. I think the Mechagodzilla thing I mentioned is a bit of a stretch, but it was something that I saw and I'm like, it reminds me a little of GVK.
But at least the Element X and the villain style and the Antarctic part, I definitely think could have some connections. There's even hovercrafts in both films.
Oh yeah, that surprised me when that showed up in this film. I'm like, oh, okay.
I have a thought on that, but we'll talk about that when we get there.
I had no memory of it appearing in the film, so I was just like, okay, I guess we have a funny flying car. But if we want to speak about similarities between King Kong Escapes and other films, I think there's another elephant in the room. James Bond.
Yeah, this is true.
Doctor
Do we
Who.
want to talk about that now, or do we want to hold off because of the later connections to James Bond?
Well, I'll just mention here that from beginning to end, Doctor Who is the epitome of a James Bond villain. I mean, some people have even pointed out the similarities, surface level similarities between, him and Dr. No from the original James Bond film, which actually I have now seen, believe it or not. I've seen my first James Bond film.
I still haven't seen a James Bond movie.
Mm.
I know there's also people who have drawn similarities to Madame X and some female characters of the James Bond franchise.
I mean, the actress Mihama would go on to be a Bond girl.
Right. And a lot of...
this year, actually, the film came out.
Wasn't it, You Only Live Twice?
Twice with
yeah.
Cousins.
Now, doesn't that also have an appearance by Akihiko Wakabayashi?
Yeah, who was actually originally meant to play Madame X in this film before Mihama was cast.
Huh.
Yeah. The reason she didn't play Madame X, I believe, was I think her contract with Toho expired and she kind of became like more like freelance, I believe, actress.
Gotcha.
From what I recall.
Makes sense. But kind of going back here to the film, unless you have anything else you want to say, we could talk about Mechanic Kong's... Not yet?
I mean, like, I don't have anything else to say on like.
Gotcha. We do get to see Mechanic Kong in action. Mechanic Kong goes down into the ravine to mine Element X, which we then find out the radiation is too strong and fries Mechanic Kong.
Circuits.
Mm-hmm. And then begins the dilemma that Doctor Who and Madame X then have to figure out, which is how can they mine this Element X, in general, because Mechanic Kong cannot do it. So they start repairing him, and they try to fix him to make him resistant to Element X.
Yeah. Meanwhile, cutting back to Nelson and and the crew on the submarine, rock slide happens underwater, causing damage to the ship, which ends up forcing them to have to do repairs, and they eventually make landfall on Mondo Island. How convenient.
Which I love the futuristic flying vehicle. I think that's such a fun little like sci-fi element.
Yeah, it's a fun little design. I was just surprised that it was in the movie at all. I had no memory of it.
It sticks out like a store, like, because honestly, like, yeah, you have a radio control device for Kong, and you have a giant robot Kong, and you have this like Element X thing, and then of course you just have a giant gorilla and a giant dinosaur and a sea serpent too.
There's nothing really like super out of like futuristic technology. It's kind of just like everything else is like believable enough in the sense of like cartoon logic.
Yes. And so like this just random introduction to this hovercraft. It's certainly a hovercraft because it moves with
it flies.
It flies. So that's it. It's kind of like a whoa. Okay, so now we have hovercrafts, and it is the only thing in this film that I think breaks the the believable barrier. If I'm gonna be honest,
see, it's not that this film is a very grounded or realistic film. It's just that this sticks out as a sore thumb for just being really sci-fi compared to everything else going on.
Right. But it's a war. I welcome it. I'm not like it doesn't
mind
hurt
it.
The film.
It's just bizarre.
It is. So Carl, Jiro, and Susan land on Mondo Island, and they see a native that's screaming something in a native tongue, which is something along the lines of "Turn back. This is Kong's sacred land. It is forbidden for you."
Yeah, you guys are trespassing.
Yes.
Yeah. Jiro and Nelson try and go to talk to the men while they leave Susan behind with the hovercraft. And then a dinosaur appears.
Yes. Now, real quick, I do want to say it's kind of weird that there's only one native.
Yeah. I mean, they even addressed that in the film. Like, there were a bunch. Like, Nelson mentions that there were a ton previously, but for some reason, there's now only one. It's not really addressed why.
Yeah. But yeah, Gorosaurus appears, and we get this scene reeks of the T-Rex versus King Kong in 33, right, which is what it was.
That's what it's a homage to.
Yeah. Susan's screaming, and then Kong like wakes up and comes out of his cave and sees everything going on and goes down to see what's going on. Nelson and Nomura come back, and they see Gorosaurus, and they freak out. But then they also see Kong come out of the jungle and grab Susan.
During this, whole sequence, I really noticed all the cues from Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, in the music.
Yes, this is when I realized, like, oh, this score is just taking from all of, I mean, Ifukube does that all the time. Like,
yeah, I mean, there's parts of this movie score in like a scene a little later that is just like, hey, I'm like, isn't that Baby Godzilla's theme from Mechagodzilla 2?
Mm-hmm. Or the War of the Gargantuas, one of those main themes pops up in here.
I haven't seen that film, so I wouldn't know.
Oh, well, one of the songs from that is like prolific through the final act of the film. The Ghidorah stuff is in here, which is also from Rodan.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of music in this. This is definitely not Ifukube's most iconic It almost feels like a best of.
He's playing some of his most iconic tracks.
Yeah, but it's definitely, it feels more like a best of Ifukube musical score. It's good music. It just, none of it is like. I would
associate any of it with this film.
Yes.
Because I associate it with the other films that it's from.
Right. But we do get a nice fight between King Kong and Gorosaurus here. Mm-hmm. Kong is brutal to Gorosaurus. Gorosaurus, of course, does his iconic
kangaroo
kicks, like 4 times in a row. Yeah. He bites Kong. He bites Kong's arm. But then Kong, like once he gets Gorosaurus on the ground, just starts beating him brutally. Gorosaurus does bite Kong's foot and leg, but Kong just continues to beat the poor dinosaur up.
Yeah, and eventually finishes him off with the iconic jawbreaker.
Right, which Rankin Bass wanted it to be a very bloody scene.
Yeah.
But Tsuburaya fought against that and said, no, this is a children's film. If you're going to make a children's film, it should be foam bubbles instead of blood. Which is kind of funny because like a few years later, you would have fake Godzilla just absolutely obliterate Anguirus's lower jaw.
And on top of what he does to Godzilla's neck. Or, well, what Mechagodzilla does to Godzilla's neck.
Right, and even before that, you had Gigan that like made Godzilla bleed from the shoulder and the on his head.
I mean, I was also thinking about how at the end of this movie, when Doctor Who dies, he's just coughing up blood.
Right, and then even in this film, you have Doctor Who shoots. Spoiler alert! Shoots both Madam X, which he does have a little bloodshed on her shoulder, and then you see her dramatically die without any blood. But you also see Doctor Who shoot the native, who then later comes back up and says his final words and then dies. So there's like some actual human violence, human on human violence, and blood. And like you said, Doctor Who's death is very bloody. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of surprising that like he didn't fight on those, but
I've only seen this film once before. It's been a fair few years since I saw it. I had a vague memory of like the general gist of the movie. But I couldn't remember. I didn't remember at all that Doctor Who actually died in this movie. So I'm like, they actually kill him? Oh, I thought he was just gonna like escape or go to prison or something.
Kind of like a Saturday morning cartoon thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's how it went in the show. Because he was a recurring villain in the show.
Right.
And I think even Mechanicon made like 2 or 3 appearances, if I recall.
He did.
Although I think only one of those episodes is available in any capacity. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it is kind of weird to see like Mechanicon got absolutely obliterated, Gorosaurus got absolutely obliterated, the Sea Serpent got obliterated, and Doctor Who ended up getting obliterated, and all of his henchmen too. It's probably because Toho had 0 plans to do a sequel. Like they knew that after this they weren't doing another Kong movie. Mm-hmm. Granted, Kong would show up in a draft of Destroy All Monsters, but that draft of like very quickly just got tossed because they didn't have the time to produce the film before Kong's rights reversed back to RKO. So it is interesting to see Toho. I mean, they obviously put in all the money because they had all of their heavy hitters work on this film. They had Ifukube, they had Honda, they had Tsuburaya, Honda's main cinematographer. You, of course, had Takarada in this film, headlining it. Even the actor for Doctor Who was a prolific Toho character actor.
We love Hideo Yamamoto.
And like the henchmen were other classic Toho supporting
Oh yeah,
cast
you got
members.
Susumu Kurobe, Toru Ibuki, various others.
Um,
The guy
So,
from
like-
Mothra vs. Godzilla, whose name I will never remember for the life of me.
and then like Tanaka, of course, was producing, which he produced all of these. So,
Yes,
like that's-
Tanaka.
But like you had all, and Nakajima, of course, was the Kong suit actor, and they had like Rhodes Reasons. They had an American actor in this, and it was co-produced with an American studio, much like their UPA films that were very much some of the biggest of the 60s for Toho. So this film like is set up to be a huge Toho film, but there's also just this level of like, this is it.
Mhm.
They even had Takashi Kimura write the script. That was one of Toho's two main monster writers.
Which is kind of bizarre when you realize how this is a much lighter film compared to Kimura's usual material.
Right. Even like Madame X, even though she does die. And I guess with that understanding and that context, it makes sense why you would have the native die and Madame X die.
Yeah.
Henchmen
You've
and
definitely
Doctor
got
Who.
those Kimura bits of the Kimura darkness, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But the film is also very like Madame X does have a redemption arc later. Kong, like fighting Mechanic Kong and the Gorosaurus fight and the Sea Serpent and your main characters, it's all very light. It's very positive. I can't help but think that's probably because Arthur Rankin, who acted as a producer on the film and had a lot to say on the film, also like put in and like stepped in, and even Rhodes Reason apparently rewrote all of his lines. And was keeping an eye on things. He like had the power to change how the set was designed. So perhaps it was because Kimura was, Honda, of course, would have some say. Tanaka would have say. Then you had Arthur Rankin and Rhodes Reason also having.
From what I understand, Rhodes Reason's changes was mostly just like to the English line. It's like just making certain lines just make more sense in English compared to how they were written in the script.
But also just hearing Rhodes Reason talk about the film kind of like angers me.
How so?
Because the dude has nothing positive to say about it.
Really?
In his interviews for Monsters Are Attacking Tokyo, the Stuart Galbraith film, he's like, Ishirō Honda was he talks about how the Japanese filmmaking style is very primitive. It's very old Hollywood. Honda was this eccentric, crazy B-movie director that would fit perfectly in a B-movie film. Rhodes Reason had no respect for Honda, and would tell Honda that he would not do as he was told and would do it a different way.
See, that's a very different vibe from what I got from Rhodes Reason's interview with Brett Homnick, which I would presume that's a more
Probably
recent
later.
interview.
Yeah,
that'd be in like 2010s, I'd imagine. Because he's a lot more positive about Honda and the Japanese film industry, in that he does kind of point out how the Japanese film industry, how it was set up, was essentially just like doing trying to copy what Hollywood was doing. But he also talked about how like courteous they were in the Japanese film industry, whereas there was just so many luxuries given to him compared to the American film industry. And like he talked about like Honda, he didn't really have much of a relationship with Honda because like he was working with him through an interpreter, as was Linda Miller. But like he never really insulted Honda in anything he said in that interview. So that's
in his earlier interviews, he's very much like, he straight up says he only did it so he could go to Japan. He wanted a way to be able to go to Japan to enjoy the culture. He talked about how when they went on location filming for 2 weeks, the entire time he basically just stayed at the hotel and relaxed and ate.
I mean, from what I understand, that was partially because, like, the first 2 weeks they went to, like, an island. And the first 2 weeks of filming, on that island, they literally couldn't shoot anything because it was raining. So they were actually there for about 4 weeks total.
Gotcha. And then I know Rhodes Reason talked very highly of Takarada. He talked about how Takarada was the Cary Grant of Japan. He was very respectful. They had a great relationship, even though they didn't really know what was going on, like what each other were saying.
I mean, Takarada did apparently like speak some English to him,
but it wasn't a lot.
No. I mean, but like Takarada was like the one person from the set that Rhodes Reason would occasionally like go out with every now and again. So yeah,
and even like in the interview that he did with Galbraith, he talked about how he had recently seen Linda Miller, and he was like, she married somebody and gained a ton of weight, and she's now like a real estate agent in California, and I guess her life really went downhill based off of what I saw. Yeah, no, he was like brutal.
Wow, okay.
He was brutal, and it was like, oh my god, dude, you and Russ Tamblyn, like, we need more Nick Adams. Like,
I mean, Rhodes was friends with Nick Adams, apparently.
But Nick Adams was like, he loved his, like, he actually, like, took it seriously and did a great job and, like, actually, like, put in effort. But it sounds like Rhodes Reason just was there for the heck of it, and Russ Tamblyn did it because of a contract.
I mean, apparently Russ Tamblyn in recent years kind of regrets his like just completely out of it performance in Gargantuas, from what I've heard.
Probably because people now look at that film and they're like, this is a great work of kaiju art. Look at the writing. But you got Russ Tamblyn. Like, the biggest complaint that film now has in retrospective is Russ Tamblyn's awful acting. I
mean, for what it's worth, ignoring Rhodes Reason as a person, he gives a decent performance here. I think
he does. It looks like he's having fun.
Yeah, and I mean, he was for a lot of it. He was also mentoring the completely inexperienced Linda Miller as well.
Right. The scene where we first were introduced to her in this version of the film, that was her first day of filming, and like between Rhodes Reason and Takarada, they both kind of taught Linda Miller how to act, essentially. And Linda Miller doesn't have a huge acting credit. She has 3 other credits to her name, one of them being a television show, I think, where she was on 1 episode.
Yeah.
So it's not like she has a lot of acting experience. King Kong Escapes was her second film, or I think it was her first film. Yeah.
First.
And then she had 1 other gig in Japan, and then she did 2 in the States, and that's been it. I'm kind of surprised, with recent films like you had Peggy Neal show up in The Great Buddha Arrival, and Akira Kubo and Akira Takarada, and like Kaiju Island of Fire has Robert Scott Field and Tomoko Ai and a few other alumni actors. I'm kind of surprised that with Linda Miller back, like, she has an agent, she has a talent agent and all that. I'm kind of surprised nobody's been like, hey, why don't you come on and do something? I know Nathan of the Monster Island Film Vault, I don't know if I'm supposed to be talking about this, but at one point, a long time ago, a couple of years ago, he reached out and tried to get her on his show to play Susan again, because his show takes place in a world where all the kaiju exist and whatnot. And she was not allowed to do podcast appearances as a character. I know since then, like, she's been on Brendan Morley's show, just talking about the film, and like she's done con appearances out the wazoo and all that, but like she's not like I remember that very, very vividly, that like he reached out and asked and was told that she's not doing podcast appearances right now, and that was the end of that. So I don't know what or why she hasn't done anything. I would imagine that, you know, she would get a gig in a indie kaiju film pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, from the interview I saw, I was watching this earlier today, it seems she'd be interested in doing some roles, you know? Kaiju, non-kaiju even. Who knows? Maybe someone will listen to us here and be like, oh.
Maybe. I don't know if we have that kind of pull, but you never know. It's always
probably
worth a
not,
shot.
but you never know.
We went.
I'm going to take credit either way if it happens.
We went really off the main topic here of the plot.
Yeah, going back to the film, our trio try to escape Mondo Island after Kong has defeated the Gorosaurus. And while Kong's watching off in the distance, a giant sea serpent appears for some reason.
Yeah, it's a surprise third kaiju. I will say this, during this sequence, between the Gorosaurus fight and this scene, I really realized that the King Kong suit is definitely not Toho's best.
Yeah, I was gonna talk about this. Yes, Toho and their third kaiju suits, they didn't really figure out how to do that well until 1973 with Zone Fighter, where they have a kaiju Bakugan whose fur looks actually really good, but they never really worked it out with King Kong, unfortunately.
Now, I know they made two suits for this film, much like they did for King Kong versus Godzilla.
Yeah,
one with
but
long
if you also
arms.
notice, did you ever notice how so he fights the giant sea serpent in the water, right? Did you notice how for certain shots his head looks
huge,
really massive? Yeah.
Humongoloid. Isn't that the 62 suit?
Yeah. I only realized that like an hour ago or so. Where it's the reason his head was so big is because they put the 67 head on the 62 suit.
Yeah. So technically 3 suits were used for this. The short-armed where Nakajima could like animate the entire body. The long-armed one, which is meant to make him look like he's kind of walking on all fours, where he couldn't operate the actual hands. And then the water suit, in air quotes, which is them just using the 1962 suit with the 67 head on it for all the water scenes. It's also important, I guess, here we could note, since 1962, that suit had been reused in 1966 for the Goro suit for the episode of Ultra Q with Goro in it. Second episode, that's right. So the suit had been used since then. It got used for that. And then this would be its final hurrah before they tossed it, which, I mean, anytime your suit gets demoted to water suit, that means they're done with you.
That means it's about done.
It's life, because like anytime a suit was in water, it was like gonna deteriorate immediately.
Yeah.
Which already I think the King Kong suit in this film suffers tremendously.
It's definitely the worst suit in the film compared to both Mechanical and Gorosaurus, who look great.
Yeah.
Like Gorosaurus is actually just a fantastic suit.
It is. It looks absolutely stunning.
The serpent, meanwhile, isn't the greatest puppet.
No. And the serpent tries to destroy the hovercraft, but Kong comes out and fights it.
He throws a rock and bonks it on the head, which is one of the 2 funniest moments in this film.
And then following all of this, they get into the submarine. Kong kills the serpent and then goes to the submarine. And then while they're waiting on the rudder to be fixed, Kong shakes the ship and tries to get Susan to come out.
Yeah. Yeah, he has that little song and dance with her before eventually letting them leave.
Mm-hmm.
And then he just sits on the island depressed.
Poor Kong.
Sad boy.
Now, during this, I believe we get some shots of Carl Nelson in the submarine. And I noticed that there's some jarring edits with the music that just kind of jump.
Yeah, okay. I didn't notice it in this scene. I did notice it in the final battle because of some of the edits that the US cut makes. Because there
I
are
thought it
certain
was that
are rearranged, and there's also a little scene that's deleted in this sequence. So notice how when Akira Takarada goes up to help Susan, he has a gun. He has a rifle on him that hadn't been shown previously. There's there's a scene in the Japanese cut of Carl Nelson giving Takarada a rifle and all that. So there's just a bunch of little cuts in this edit of a film, and the music is the giveaway at multiple points, especially in the final battle was when I noticed it.
Yeah, see, I noticed it here. I was like, oh, the music is jumping around. Okay.
See, I noticed it in the final battle because there's just some harsh cuts in the audio.
But following this scene, we get Nelson, Susan, and Nomura at the United Nations in New York, and they give a rundown of Kong and Kong's relationship to Susan and Gorosaurus, and we get them saying, "Hey, we're going back out, and we're gonna go research them."
Yeah.
In a way, this scene almost feels irrelevant. I mean, it does.
I mean, it's not really irrelevant because this is how Madam X learns of Kong and Susan's connection, which she informs Doctor Who of late, in the following scene.
This is true, but also I almost feel like that's not necessary. Them abducting them almost feels not needed because of Doctor Who's mind control. I mean, the mind control thing doesn't work. It ends up failing.
I mean, there's a weird contradiction in the Japanese. I heard there's a weird contradiction in the Japanese cut of the film that's kind of fixed in the US cut, where Doctor Who actively does not want. He wants to use his mind control. He doesn't really want to go with Madam X's suggestion of getting Susan to convince Kong to mine the element X, and he actually gets he's fully against the idea of that, even though in a previous scene he had ordered his men to capture Nelson and co for that very purpose. Whereas the US cut fixes it by just changing the dialogue to make it so he sort of agrees to the decision, but as long as and he just mentions how he'll dispose of Nelson and co later,
right?
Their usefulness is ended.
And that's actually in this scene, if I remember correctly, because
it's not this scene. It's a little later in the
gotcha,
film.
because this is where Madame X is telling that Kong is on Mono Island, and Susan's the one to get him.
Yeah, the change dialogue is in the scene when they're having wine together.
Gotcha. Which following this, we get Doctor Who going to Mondo, killing the one native, drugging Kong, and taking him away by helicopter, which during this scene, there's some really great cinematography with the aerial stuff. Really, really great. My favorite cinematography in the film is in this scene, with the helicopters in an extreme angle, with the helicopter in the foreground on the screen left and Kong on screen right on the rule of thirds line, roaring from
Yeah.
above. There's some really great shots in this.
Oh yeah, this yeah, there's a lot of really nice cinematography in this scene. Whereas the rest of the film I think is just mostly fine visually for Toho standards. I don't think the rest of the film is really that visually impressive.
No, not at all. I think there's some nice lighting choices.
Yeah.
But
And there's some fun like visual edits with like the compositing and like Madam X and Doctor Who's conversation, like in just the scene we were talking about prior.
Yeah.
Like that's a fun edit, but yeah, outside of that, there's not a lot of like other like visual things to marvel at outside of like the miniature effects and the suits, you know?
Right. There's a nice composite shot, much like in the style of Invasion of Astro Monster, where Kong is in Tokyo, and you have in the foreground people running around, and Kong's just standing around in the background. Very much like the shot in Astro Monster, where Godzilla is like approaching and destroying the city. But that scene has more, it's more lively because Godzilla's actively destroying the city. Kong's just kind of standing there.
Yeah.
So even then, it's not, it's nothing new. In fact, it's kind of like a downgrade to what was there prior.
I mean, Kong doesn't really ever intentionally try and destroy a building in this movie, from what I recall.
He just destroys the boat. That's the only thing he intentionally destroys.
Yeah, and like he like maybe trips over a building or two during the final fight.
See, the destruction in this film is, for the most part, pretty lacking.
Mechanic Kong just emerges from a building for some reason.
Yeah.
Even though we were shown him being deployed earlier. When that happens.
But going back here, we do get our first on-screen death with Doctor Who shooting the native, which, I mean, if you need a better reason for a villain, like that's it.
Yes, Kong's mine now.
And then bam, bam,
I love
bam.
that line.
The writing in this film is really ridiculous. And what's interesting is Rhodes' reason, because he's a member of the actors union, he got to do his own lines. But Paul Frees
to dub his
lines, yeah.
Meanwhile, Linda Miller is dubbed over, even though she was speaking English on set, you know, or on filming, she's still dubbed over by a completely different actress.
Right, and she later went on to say, like, she would have went and done her own dubbing, but she wasn't a part of the union, so she technically wasn't required to do that, and it would have cost too much to fly her from Japan to New York to get her in to the booth to record her dub lines, so they went with another voice actress. And
the same actress who voices Madam X in this film.
Yes. She did all the female characters, while Paul Frees did almost all the male voices in the dubbed version. He was in films like The Thing from Another World, Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, The Beginning of the End, The Magic Sword, and he did voice acting for Hell in the Pacific, Tora, 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 and even did The Flight of Dragons, which was animated by Toei, and also the film The Last Unicorn. He did some voice work for that. But the voice acting in this film is very hammy. That just adds to the insanity.
Oh, I love the performance for Doctor Who, like the voice acting for Doctor Who.
Yeah, Paul Frees does a
Kong's mine now.
It's really like, this film would work perfectly as like a weekend afternoon matinee kind of film.
This is the kind of movie that you just sit back, pop open a beer for, man.
Like it's just dumb fun. But then speaking of dumb fun, we then go back to the Arctic, which again, amazing set. And we get the establishment. Doctor Who is controlling King Kong with mind controls.
I like the fun edit, by the way, the Astro Monster-esque edit of like Nelson mentioning to Jiro we'll find Kong. We'll find him as long as they haven't taken him to the North Pole.
Yeah, that little audible,
I love that little gag.
Yeah, that one I was like, wow, that's funny. And so, they then embark on their journey to find Kong, where they also meet the native. They actually finally meet the native, and he, says his final words and then dies. Where Nelson then somehow figures out it's Doctor Who behind all of this, like very much cartoon logic.
Mm. Yeah, the native just mentions like a devilish man, and Nelson deduces it has to be Doctor Who.
Right, like there's nobody else on the planet that it could be. It's got to be Doctor Who. So then they go off of the island, and they're contacted and told to bring all of their evidence and information on Kong and Mondo Island, and for them three to get on this helicopter, and they're going to fly off to the UN, which they do, and they realize, wait a minute, these people aren't Japanese. These people are. There's something.
They're played by Japanese actors,
right? There's something kooky about this, and then that's when we go to the Arctic. Doctor Who is mind controlling Kong, and they send Kong off to go get Element X, which we watch Kong do the same stuff Mechanic Kong does. However, he's more successful and actually gets to Element X, but then the mind control stops working.
Yeah. Kong eventually throws away his ear implants, the speakers, I guess they are. Tries running away, but is just locked in his cage.
Poor monkey.
Poor monkey. And then Nelson Koa brought into the base.
And then we get some back and forth between Doctor Who and Nelson. And
yeah, they have a bit of a history. It's like, it's not really established very well what their history is. It's just they have a history, and the plans for Mechanic Kong were drafted up by Nelson and Jiro, and that Doctor Who just kind of stole them.
It's an interesting relationship that definitely could use some added context, but
yeah, in a way, it's almost more charming that it doesn't have that extra context.
Yeah, it goes back to the whole cartoon logic that this film is either plagued or graced with. Yeah,
I would argue graced.
I think it's a little bit of both.
I wouldn't disagree entirely.
Doctor Who does eventually throw them in the cell, and they just chill there, real like Mechagodzilla style-esque, and then they pull Nelson, and they're like trying to freeze Jiro and Susan in the meantime.
Yeah, Madam X tries to seduce Nelson
in a real James Bond-esque way.
Yes. Fun fact: apparently, for some reason, this scene was reshot so it's actually different footage, or at least a different take in the US cut compared to the Japanese version for this scene for some reason. For like part of the scene, like when Nelson and Madam X are like on the couch, it's like the same footage. Like when she's just like making the drinks for her and him, it's for some reason it's different footage. No clue why.
Huh. That is an interesting change. I really wish I could see the Japanese version of this.
I mean, you can find there's like a video on YouTube that details the differences. So at least give that a watch sometime if you're curious.
I need to.
But yeah, should also mention that Madam X, her whole role in this is that. Did we already mention that she's like some sort of agent for another country?
No, this is where it's really and honestly revealed.
Revealed in a very vague sense.
Yeah, because Carl Nelson like accuses her of like being Chinese, Thai, Russian, And she's like, no, 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 no. And then Doctor Who's like, you're getting very warm. Too warm.
I mean, even Doctor Who doesn't even know what country she's from. There's actually dialogue that's cut from the American version between Madam X and Doctor Who about like what country she's from.
And all that's really established is that it's an Asian country.
Yeah, some Asian country that if they get a hold of this Element X deposit under Doctor Who's base, they'll be able to rival or even conquer, like rule the world compared to with like a nuclear arsenal.
Right. And, you know, Nelson and Doctor Who have a back and forth, and Nelson doesn't budge. They send Nelson back.
Yeah, but Doctor Who also immediately takes him back out again to try and convince him to cooperate.
Right. This whole scene, like, this stuff kind of feels like it takes a halt almost. Like, the film kind of stops here.
A little, yeah. Nelson is strangely calm about this whole situation, playing a nice game of chess with Doctor Who while his friends are freezing to death.
Right.
And then eventually Doctor Who just gives up on it and leaves Nelson alone.
Which is not the smartest of decisions for
No.
any of those.
Doctor Who makes some pretty dumb decisions in this. Well, this isn't the climax. It's kind of right before the climax.
Right.
Like, he tries to get Jiro and Susan to cooperate, but you know, they're interrupted by King Kong escaping, just like the title says.
Oh, that's funny because that's what the title's called.
It is. And yeah, and so they just leave Susan and Jiro unattended to deal with Kong. Susan is not restrained in any ways, and they leave the keys to the chains that Takarada is shackled to. They leave the keys on the desk. So they just escape.
And then they end up getting... are intercepted by Madame X.
Yeah,
who's
after
then
meeting
like,
up with Nelson.
Yeah. And
she just takes them to her room where they
are chilling.
Yeah, until like Doctor Who comes in to just capture them again.
Right. And then so Kong swims away and Mechanic Kong tries to stop Kong, but it doesn't work out. And then when Doctor Who enters Madame X's room, he like tries to convince them again.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just all get aboard Doctor Who's ship and goes after Kong.
Yeah, who's heading to Tokyo.
Right, and then we get some shots of Kong in Tokyo while Doctor Who is trying to figure this part out. And Madame X gets our three main characters out of their shackles and helps them out. Which, Madame X is such a weird character. Like, she goes through this change just all of a sudden with no... Like, they try to give her a reason, but it's like...
Justification with, like, her not wanting a bunch of civilians to die from Kong and Mechanic Kong's fight, because either A, out of the goodness of her heart, or B, to not cause an international incident with her country because of her involvement, I guess. But it's a weird arc.
Yeah, and it's kind of out of nowhere, and then she, like, has to stay behind... For some reason, it's honestly just for dramatic effect.
Yeah. I mean, hey, at least Kimura, unlike Destroy All Monsters, Kimura is actually trying to do something with characters here.
Yeah.
So I'll give him that credit. I actually remember Madame X as a character.
I think, and to that point, I think all the main characters here are memorable.
Yeah,
like Doctor Who's,
and I'd say they're pretty fun. Yeah, Doctor Who is a far more memorable of a villain than the Kilax.
Right, and then Madame X is an interesting side villain, and then Takarada, even though
Takarada.
Yeah, he doesn't play like a very memorable character. Like, I don't think his performance is this in this film is his like highlight, but it's Takarada. Linda Miller plays an iconic character as one of Kong's, leading ladies. They're always a memorable part of the films they're in. unless you're Linda Hamilton because you're in the worst Kong film made. And then like Rhodes' reason is just, he's the main character, so he has his time to shine.
Right, except in the finale where he does basically nothing for most of it.
The finale's really and honestly for Takarada and Miller, which there's an allusion to maybe something more going on there. At least I kind of took it that way.
Yeah,
but it doesn't really. I mean, they don't really develop it at all. It's much like the love story in Destroy All Monsters, where it's like you can tell it's there, but nothing happens.
I mean, in Destroy All Monsters, it's more clear that they actually are in a relationship, and it adds some stakes. Like it kind of adds more emotional stakes to the film, given it's the main character's girlfriend gets mind brainwashed by the aliens.
Mm-hmm.
The romance element with Takarada and Linda Miller is just like kind of established in the last like 30 minutes of the film.
Right. And it is what it is.
It's just kind of a bit too little too late.
Right. But I will say, while this film I think does the love story a little bit worse than Destroy All Monsters, which I think is already less than stellar, this cast, I mean, the only person from Destroy All Monsters that's remotely memorable is Akira Kubo, because he's the main
I would argue
character.
Kenji Sahara's one scene of a character moment is one of the most memorable scenes in that movie.
Yeah, but I don't know. Just as characters in general, I think of when I think of Destroy All Monsters, I think
low
of
bar.
Akira Kubo and Keelok Lady.
Yeah.
And that's it. And I'd say the girlfriend.
Tsuchiya.
Yeah. But
just because of the scene where he jumps out the window. That's what I remember.
That's the sole thing I remember. So, but they're not as good of characters as this, and I still don't think these are good characters, but I definitely do think they're still
fun and memorable.
Yeah. Now, that does lead me to suggest this. And this might be, I think there is a bit of contention here on who is the better writer. But I'm kind of thinking that Takeshi Kimura is not the better writer between Sekizawa and him.
Yeah. I mean, Takeshi Kimura, Matanga's great, but
in his kaiju films, so like
his kaiju stories, I'd say they tend to be weaker than like a lot of what Sekizawa was doing, especially in terms of their characters. Like, I would say out of this film and Kimura's two Godzilla films that he wrote to.
Yeah, his kaiju credits, I'm jumping the gun here, but his kaiju credits are Rodan, which admittedly Rodan's very good.
Rodan. That's right. I haven't seen Rodan in like 5 years, so I can't really comment.
Frankenstein versus Baragon, The War of the Gargantuars, great duology. I think those are his strongest ones, followed by Rodan. King Kong Escapes, Destroy All Monsters, and Godzilla versus Hedorah.
Okay. Which I've only seen Rodan. Well, I don't know. I've seen Frankenstein vs. Baragon, but that's been a while as well. So out of the ones in recent memory for me, it's King Kong Escapes, Destroy All Monsters, and Hedorah. And yeah, I'd say in comparison to his Godzilla works, King Kong Escapes actually has memorable characters. Whereas Godzilla works, I struggle to tell you anything about the cast of Hedorah outside of there's a kid, there's the professor, there's the blinded professor,
who loves science, the wife who loves her husband,
the other dude,
there's the dude who loves sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and the lady who loves drugs.
That's about the most I could tell you. There was those people in a field.
And honestly, the thing about Hedorah that makes it iconic is more the visual art.
It's
like style.
it's the style and direction of that film, because Hedorah is such a uniquely directed film in the series, especially for the Showa era. So that's kind of what makes Hedorah a memorable film.
Right.
I mean, also Hedorah doesn't really have as much time to develop its human cast because it's got so much Godzilla screen time.
Right, and there's so much going on in that film too that just there's a lot going on. But like Rodan, Frankenstein, and Gargantuas are all great Kimura films. Those are all very, very solid. I don't know what happened, but the moment that Kimura had to work on established characters, it fell through. Like King Kong Escapes, Destroy All Monsters, Godzilla versus Hedorah. Like, just I don't know what it is. But if you're looking, like, Kimura's highs are really, really high. Like the three I mentioned, some of the best kaiju films, period.
Mm-hmm. On top of like his other works like Matango.
Right. But then you get his last three kaiju works, and like they're the bottom of the barrel, or like mid-tier at best for writing. Now, Sekizawa, like, he has some of the worst, and he has some of the best, and he has a lot in the middle. Like, he did so much that, like, he has that ability to have such a range of quality.
Right, but I mean, also Sekizawa, it's kind of well known that Sekizawa at a certain point lost his passion for writing the kaiju scripts just because he kept getting asked to do the Godzilla films.
Right. So in regards to Sekizawa, like,
so it's no surprise really that there's a bit of a range in quality for some films.
Right. And even like his first one was meant to just be a television project, Vera and the Unbelievable. Mm-hmm. But then you have stuff like Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster and Invasion of Astro Monster. And suddenly it's like, okay, it makes sense why this dude had the work he had. Or King Kong versus Godzilla, or Mothra versus Godzilla, all of which are very well made. At one point, Sekizawa was writing the King Kong movie.
Yeah.
But it ended up in Kimura's hands, and we got a less than, I would say, stellar film through his writing and Honda's probably revisions, and then Rankin's revisions and Rhodes' Reason's corrections. Mm-hmm. I think the film just, there's too many chefs in the kitchen. And Kimura just didn't have it. I don't know what happened between, Gargantuas and this, but whatever happened, this was the beginning of a spiral down for Kimura's work in the kaiju genre.
See, I don't know if I agree with the statement that it feels like there's too many cooks in the kitchen. It's more of a case of just like, because of the cartoon logic, a lot of things are just underdeveloped and or just, I mean, in Madame X's case, her arc is just really weird, and the romance with Takarada is, again, like, underdeveloped. Just, it's established and it's maybe it's set up a little early on with, like, Linda Miller taking like trying to bandage up Takarada's forehead injury at the beginning. I guess there is a little bit of slight setup for it, but it's really like
subtle,
easy to like just miss. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think we went on to a very interesting side discussion here, but I think might be best to conclude our King Kong Escapes plot breakdown.
I'm not even entirely sure. I don't even remember where we were.
We just got through Madame X. Yeah, Kong's heading to Tokyo. Doctor Who is in Tokyo Bay. Our three main characters have escaped. Madame X has been captured and is taken to Doctor Who, where she's kept for the rest of her screen time.
Mm-hmm. Carl Nelson goes to the I guess the Japanese military leader to convince them not to fire upon Kong in order to avoid a rampage. Meanwhile, Susan goes to try and pacify him. And then Mechanic Kong shows up.
Yep, just kind of out of nowhere.
Pops out of a building for some reason.
And then Mechanic Kong tries to, like, hypnotize Kong.
Yeah.
And, like, you would think that the fight between the two would be pretty cool, right? But
I mean, it starts off pretty good. Yeah, there's a little funny moment where you can tell the suit actor Hiroshi Sekita trips over a building, and then he punches Kong.
And then, like, Mechanic Kong also tries to, like, literally flash Kong. Which does kind of work. It does kind of work. But then, thanks to some meddling with Nomura, they destroy that device. And then they fight, but then Mechanic Kong gets Susan and starts climbing Tokyo Tower, and then Kong follows behind, and then Doctor Who tries to convince Kong to surrender.
Yeah. Oh yeah, again with that cartoon logic, throughout the entirety of the movie, Kong just understands the English language. Or I guess in the Japanese cut it would be Japanese and English.
Yeah. Eventually when Kong doesn't, Kong just continues to be Kong, Mechanic Kong tries to, like, throw Susan to her death, which Kong catches her and sets her down. Meanwhile, Takarada's trying to get up there to get Susan.
Mm-hmm.
And then they, like, Kong and Mechanic Kong kind of fight. And then Madame X destroys Mechanic Kong's remote controls. And then Doctor Who shoots her. And then she dies in this really dramatic death.
Yeah. All the while Mechanic Kong falls, breaking apart into a bucket of bolts.
Which Mechanic Kong's defeat here, I must say, is really underwhelming. Like, it's not even to Kong.
Yeah, I was surprised when I did not remember the fact that he was actually not defeated by Kong. I mean, I'm, like, not offended by it. Like, I actually don't mind this final fight. I think it's fun. But it was a bit odd that, he's defeated by, Madam X's interference.
Another direct connection to Mechagodzilla. One of the human characters destroys the remote control in the villain's hideout. Yeah. I don't know. It could be.
Hey, at least this time it wasn't due to alcoholism.
This is true.
Which would almost be more fitting in this movie, honestly.
It almost would. And then Takarada's character gets to the top of the tower, rescues Susan, they get down. And then the next day, Doctor Who, like, embarks on his boat to get out.
Yeah, for some reason he waits till the next morning.
And then you see Kong with our main characters in a little car just driving next to him. Cartoon logic, baby. And then Susan tells Kong to go stop the ship. And then Kong goes and destroys the ship,
murdering every single crew member aboard, including Doctor Who.
And then Kong just swims off.
Back to Mondo Island.
And then everybody's happy, and then the movie ends. And then if you have the Blu-ray, the movie just starts again because there's no actual...
there's no menu.
Menu, yeah. Do you have... It just ends so quickly. It's like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Do you have any final... I've got, my final thoughts, and I've got one other piece of information. But I'm basically ready to move on to the next section after that.
Mm-hmm. Just probably one sort of anecdote that I thought was interesting that I kind of wanted to mention was about Mechanic Kong's design. So apparently, Mechanic Kong's design, interestingly enough, was actually a combination of a design submitted by the American company, Rankin Bass, and what the Japanese team involving Tsuburaya's team and everyone that was involved in that came up with. Because like according to Teriyoshi Nakano, they had the idea for including Mechani Kong, but they had to get the opinion of Rankin Bass. And Rankin Bass would then submitted them a design, but they didn't like it at all. But they kind of had to take elements from it anyways, and so they mixed what they wanted to do with the Rankin Bass design.
Gotcha. Interesting. The only thing I have left, information-wise, is the budget for this film was 170 million yen, or $472,000 USD. So if you're ready, I got kind of my final thoughts here, and then you can give yours, and then we'll go into the cast and the crew.
Yep. Sounds good.
Honestly, like at the end of the day, King Kong Escapes, it is a fun movie. It's camp. It's camp. This is like the, I think, epiphany of 1960s Toho kaiju film camp. But I think it also lacks a bit of that seriousness that makes the genre boom of the 60s so iconic. The film is very cartoony. And I think it kind of hurts itself because of that, because it is undoubtedly a King Kong movie. And I don't know necessarily if cartoony is the way you go with King Kong. I think you can do comedy. King Kong vs. Godzilla is an example of a very smart film that uses comedy and satire, and it works. But when you go for a straight comedy, it I think kind of suffers from that. Doctor Who is crazy, but very memorable in almost a it's so bad it's good kind of way. I think I really do feel like this film fits in the B movie world of the 1960s camp genre films.
Right.
It certainly feels like a Saturday morning cartoon. And it's honestly, I really hate the fact that this was our last film that had the Honda, Tsuburaya, Ifukube trio. And let's throw Tanaka in there too. This was the last time the four would work together directly on a film.
Right, because while Tsuburaya was like obviously involved in Destroy All Monsters, it's documented that he was more actively involved in King Kong Escapes.
Right. And then in All Monsters Attack, of course, Ifukube did not come back. And Tsuburaya was not involved really at all with that because he couldn't.
Right.
So that was just a Tanaka Tsuburaya or Tanaka Honda production. And I mean, later on, you did have Terror of Mechagodzilla that saw your Tanaka, Honda, and Ifukube, but by that point, Tsuburaya had long passed away. So it kind of sucks that the main four people that birthed Godzilla, this is their final hurrah. Right. It's kind of fitting because King Kong was the film.
It's definitely very fitting, especially for Tsuburaya, for this to sort of be his last big hurrah in the kaiju films. Yeah, the man who loved King Kong so much that he got his own 35mm print purely so he could study the film. I think it is poetically fitting for him to have gotten this as his big last hurrah. And yeah, like you said, this is 100% like B movie camp, beginning to end, helped or not helped by the fact that, it's in the West, all our only access to it is through the dub. And, while I love the performance for Doctor Who, I think I can understand where bad dubbing complaints come in for the voice actress who does Linda Miller.
Right.
Who I don't think is giving a very great performance as Linda Miller's character.
Right. No, and I do wonder because like my opinion of King Kong versus Godzilla absolutely like did a 180 when I watched the Japanese version. I'd be curious to see if if ever the Japanese version were to be accessible.
From what I understand, the differences are nowhere near as major. I mean, in the US, the John Beck cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla just completely changes the tone and like comedy of the film entirely.
Right.
Whereas
I don't know.
It's mostly just a small handful of scenes are omitted. There's a couple dialogue changes, and
I think there's one kaiju sequence. That is cut. That is brought back, or that is omitted from the U.S. version. That's in the Japanese.
Not as far as I'm aware. My best guess for what you're talking about is the Toho Champion Festival release cuts out the giant serpent scene.
Gotcha. I don't know. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. I do know that at least in terms of the editing, the music wouldn't jump around as much. So at least the music would be better in the Japanese version. Yeah,
because that's literally just because like in the American cut they rearrange like certain moments and obviously omit like certain shots and small moments. Like there's a moment like when Takarada is rescuing Linda Miller. There's like a whole bit in the Japanese cut of her like almost falling off Tokyo Tower that is pretty much entirely omitted.
So I don't know. Maybe I'd like it. Maybe it wouldn't do anything.
From what I know of the differences, I don't think they'd make that major of a change, but I haven't seen it, to be fair. So, full disclosure there. But nonetheless, I still enjoyed this film. It's a fun little monster romp with King Kong.
Did you have anything else you wanted to say before we go into the cast and crew?
I love Hideo Yamamoto's performance.
Well, speaking of which, we're going to transition here into the always iconic part of me reading off a handful of the cast and crew credits. I love it when I do a Toho film because I have a list a mile long for just two people. Here we go. Okay. For your director, you have Ishirō Honda, whose credits include Godzilla, Half Human, Rodan, The Mysterians, The H-Man, Varan, Battle in Outer Space, The Human Vapor, Mothra, Gorath, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Matango, Atragon, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Dogora, Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, Invasion of Astro Monster, The War of the Gargantuas, Destroy All Monsters, Latitude Zero, All Monsters Attack, Space Amoeba, and lastly, Terror of Mechagodzilla. For producer, you have Tomoyuki Tanaka, whose credits include Godzilla, Godzilla Raids Again, Half Human, The Legend of the White Serpent, Rodan, The Mysterians, The H-Man, Varan, Monkey Son, The Three Treasures, Battle in Outer Space, The Secret of the Telesian, The Human Vapor, Mothra, The Last War, Gorath, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Matango, Atragon, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Dogora, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, Invasion of Astro Monster, The War of the Gargantuas, Ebirah, Horror of the Deep, The Killing Bottle, Son of Godzilla, Destroy All Monsters, Latitude Zero, All Monsters Attack, Space Amoeba, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, Godzilla vs. Gigan, Godzilla vs. Megalon, Submersion of Japan, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, SB, Terror of Mechagodzilla, The War in Space, The Return of Godzilla, Princess from the Moon, Godzilla vs. Biollante, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Godzilla vs. Mothra, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, and Godzilla vs. Destroya. Your writer, Takashi Kimura's credits include Rodan, The Mysterians, The H-Man, The Human Vapor, The Last War, Gorath, Matango, Samurai Pirate, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, The War of the Gargantuas, Destroy All Monsters, and Godzilla vs. Hedorah. And your last main credit for major crew members, Eiji Tsuburaya as special effects director. His credits include The Invisible Man Appears, Godzilla, The Invisible Man, Godzilla Raids Again, Half Human, Rodan, The Mysterians, The H-Man, Varan, Monkey Son, The Three Treasures, Battle in Outer Space, The Secret of the Telesian, The Human Vapor, Mothra, The Last War, Gorath, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Matango, Samurai Pirate, Atragon, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Dogora, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, Invasion of Astro Monster, The War of the Gargantuas, and Latitude Zero. For your cast, you have Akira Takarada playing Jiro Nomura, who was in Godzilla, Half Human, The Three Treasures, The Last War, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Invasion of Astro Monster, Ibra, Horror of the Deep, Latitude Zero, Godzilla vs. Mothra, Godzilla Final Wars, and most recently, The Great Buddha Arrival. Mei Hama, who played Madame X, was also in King Kong vs. Godzilla and Samurai Pirate. Rhodes Reason plays Carl Nelson. Linda Miller plays Susan Watson, which she also appeared in the film The Green Slime. And then finally, Hideo Amamoto, who played Doctor Who, was in Monkey Son, The Three Treasures, The Secret of the Talesian, Gorath, Matango, Atragon, Dogora, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Ultra Q, The Killing Bottle, Mighty Jack, All Monsters Attack, Return of Ultraman Episode 28, Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters, All Out Attack, Ultraman Cosmos Episode 57, and Message from Space. And that's your main cast and crew. So, Rex, with that, I think we're down to our rankings. First, let's do a King Kong ranking with King Kong 33, Son of Kong, King Kong vs. Godzilla, and King Kong Escapes. And then, for the heck of it, let's do a 1967 Kaiju films ranking afterwards.
Sure, why not?
So, for our King Kong rankings, what would you put at number 4?
So, at number 4, I think we're both going to agree on this one. Son of Kong.
I agree, wholeheartedly.
Mm-hmm.
For number 3, I think this is where we're going to start to differentiate. What do you got?
I want to hear yours first.
So I put King Kong Escapes at my number 3.
Okay. So this is where I'm going to get a little controversial here.
I know what you're going to say.
I'm going to put King Kong 33 at number 3.
See, right now, this sounds awful because we've only covered 4 of the 7 King Kong movies.
I should clarify, I'm not a big King Kong guy. I don't mind the monkey, but he's not my G, you know.
See,
Godzilla is my G.
I think I'm a little indifferent. Like I like King Kong. I'm more of a Godzilla guy. I like King Kong, but
when it comes to the original film, every male character is so just sexist in it. It's like Jesus Christ. I'm not even the type of person who gets like actively offended by that, but like it's a bit much even for me, you know.
Yeah. I when we get to my ranking of 33, I'll explain myself a little bit better. So for number 2, what do you got?
At number 2, I've got King Kong Escapes.
Okay, I have King Kong versus Godzilla. I enjoy the film. I do have it's not my go-to Showa Godzilla movie. I think it's intelligent, but I also if I'm gonna go watch a Showa Godzilla movie, there's about 3 or 4 others I'm gonna pick over King Kong versus Godzilla. Yeah. But it's not a bad movie by any means. I think it's upper lower class Godzilla, and I definitely think it's upper class King Kong.
Yeah, I mean King Kong Escapes, I'll say this, I didn't like it as much on this rewatch as when I first watched it. I had a lot more fun on my first watch. I did still enjoy the film overall, but its glaring writing issues and all the sorts just was kind of more apparent this time around, I'd say.
Gotcha. And then at number 1, I'm gonna be the obvious cliche here, and I'm gonna put King Kong 33.
See, I'm not afraid to tell my real opinions.
This is my real opinion. Now, I'm gonna say this: King Kong 33 is just like one notch above King Kong versus Godzilla. I don't think that King Kong 33 is that much better. I don't even think it's like it's upper, lower giant monster movie in general. I don't think it's the god tier.
It is a good movie. I can recognize its importance as a film. It's just not really a film I actively want to rewatch. Like, you and me both aren't. We're Godzilla dudes.
Yeah.
We're team all the way.
Now, speaking of Godzilla, so kaiju, King Kong is not a kaiju. I'm going to say that now.
Oh, and my number one is King Kong vs. Godzilla, if that wasn't already obvious.
Oh, fair enough. With us, I'm in the camp that says King Kong is not a kaiju outside of his appearances in King Kong vs. Godzilla and King Kong Escapes, but that is for a eventual Kaiju Conversation live discussion on what is a kaiju. But with us talking about kaiju, I do want us to do, now that we have covered all of the Japanese produced kaiju films of 1967.
I mean, we haven't done the Gamera film of that year.
Oh, have we not?
No.
Wait a minute.
We've only done the original Gamera.
Oh, so that means, okay, so we haven't covered all the major kaiju films from that year. We still have, would that be...
Gyaos?
Okay.
Yes.
So we actually should not do a ranking until we cover Gyaos. That way we surprise everybody with our official ranking of all of those. So we're going to hold off on that. I didn't even think about Dai. Thank you for that.
I felt like something was missing the entire time, but I couldn't put a finger on it.
Well, you figured it out.
But
well,
hey, sometime this year, maybe.
Maybe. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, hint, hint. Well, with that, I think I've got nothing left to really talk about in terms of King Kong Escapes. And honestly, we went longer for King Kong Escapes than I thought we would.
Yeah. I felt like that was a decent bit to talk about with film overall.
There's we went into some interesting side discussions that I think some people aren't willing to say, like the whole Takashi Kimura thing.
I mean, that's because most people don't really tend to think about these movies very much at all.
Yeah, it's...
most people don't tend to engage with the Showa Godzilla films or like a lot of the Toho sci-fi films. They just don't try to. These are just silly monster movies. Why should we care? There's some people's philosophy.
Well, I think we provided a pretty good discussion to explain why we care.
I think it's interesting.
It is interesting, especially in the context we have with other kaiju films of the time and where people were placed in their careers and whatnot. It's interesting.
Yeah.
But with that, I do think we should change gears here and enter our final segment of the show and wrap things up here. So I'm going to start us off by saying hello. I'm Elijah, and I have a kaiju and tokusatsu problem. Joking aside, I am Elijah Thomas. I am part of the rotating hosts for Monsters with Attitude. You can check us out on YouTube, where we do monthly live streams talking about kaiju entertainment. If you do want to hear me talk about another kaiju science fiction film from Toho, I did do an episode or a live stream covering Matango and Atragon, so I do get to talk about Atragon a little bit. That's the only other time I've really talked about a kaiju science fiction film from Toho. Outside of this, unless you want to count Matango, and I talk about it there and on the show. I am you can also head over to Facebook and join our Facebook group. It's a great place to talk with like-minded people. I'm also a writer. I've written for GodzillaMovies.com and in Kaiju Ramen Magazine. Currently, I write for Kaiju United. My most recent article is about an interview with Donnie Winter on his content creation. My writing has also been featured in a book called Giant Bug Cinema, a Monster Kid's Guide from Bear Manor Media, where I wrote about Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. I'm also a filmmaker and part-time YouTuber. You can check out my stuff on my YouTube channel, ET13 Productions, where you can see some of my short films and my older videos, along with a playlist that features all of my appearances on YouTube. I do plan on getting new videos out soon. I actually very recently uploaded the video version of the Donnie Winter interview, and I have more in the pipeline, so definitely check that out. I also appeared in a kaiju movie, a little-known film called Zillafoot from 2021. I made a brief cameo in the film as Skywatcher number 2. It's got a rating of 3.7 out of 10 on IMDb, so if you want to watch more kaiju, you can buy the Blu-ray on srscinema.com or the DVD from any major online retailer.
We only support Peak Cinema here, so you know it's good.
Yeah, so if you don't want to pay for it, you can watch it for free on Tubi with ads, or just buy it on Prime. You can also check out my action figure photography on my Instagram at ET13_productions, and my ex, the artist formerly known as Twitter, thanks Danny, at the same handle. Now Rex, where can people find you at?
Well, dear listeners, you can find me on YouTube at RexZeno, on Twitter at Rex_Xenomorph, and on Instagram, Rex_Xeno. And if you want to take a look at some of my writing, go check out the Tokusatsu Network.
And as for the podcasts, don't forget to rate us on iTunes. That boosts our ratings and helps us get recommended to more people just like you. If you don't have an Apple device, which I don't blame you, I don't actually, that's a lie. I'm literally staring at my laptop and it says MacBook Pro. So I need to change that. But you can also rate us on Spotify now. That's something you can do. If you want to stay up to date with all things Kaiju Conversation related, follow us on Twitter at KAIJU_CONVERS. If you don't have Twitter, you can follow us on Instagram or like us on Facebook. If you're like me before podcasting and you don't have any social media, lucky you. You can email us at kaijuconversation@gmail.com, all lowercase, all one word, you know the drill. And you can email us questions, you can email us comments or thoughts or opinions. Just send us fan mail. We will happily read it, whether it's a DM on Twitter, a DM on Instagram, a DM on Facebook, a DM or an email, or a DM on Discord, anything. Like, we'll read it out. We'll read your reviews on air for everyone to hear. We also have a Teespring store. Eventually, we're going to have original artwork on there. I'm working on it. But until then, you can sport our awesome logo on a t-shirt or maybe even a coffee mug. If you'd like to chat with us, check out our Discord server full of others that have similar interests to you. It looks like most recently in our General 1 chat, there was a discussion about the recent Godzilla statue that was put up in Japan, the Godzilla 1954 statue.
Oh, in Hibiya, yeah.
It's a great community full of great people. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you can be notified anytime we upload a video. We sometimes post exclusives to the channel, like bloopers for episodes or minisodes talking about news or other subjects. We also have an interview with Mechagodzilla designer Jared Kerchevsky on the channel, and I definitely butchered his name, I'm sorry. But we also do monthly live streams where we have a guest on and we just chat it up. And a huge thanks to Rex for editing all of these episodes and all the other content we upload. His links can be found in the description below. Along with Rex, we'd like to give a huge thanks and shout out to Danny DeManna of the Godzilla Novelization Project for his amazing vocals on our theme song. You can support him by following him on Twitter at Danzilla93_GNP or visit his website GodzillaNovelizationProject.com. And a huge thanks to Grattan Conwell from the podcast Giant Monster BS for composing the music for our theme song. You can support him by following the podcast on Twitter at Giant Monster BS or on any podcast platform under the name Giant Monster BS. And with that, we're going to wrap things up here. So thank you guys so much for listening. And as always, please remember, life's too short to not talk big. Bye, guys.
Bye.
We are set, we are in debt, there's nothing to sweat. Life's too short now, baby. To not talk big now, baby. Conversation. His name's Elijah, baby. relax now, baby. We love those kaiju, baby. And you will too now.